The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, painting streaks of color against the pristine white columns of the Tate family's newly purchased home. The oppressive silence of the suburban night was broken only by the faint crackle of a police radio and the low murmur of two men standing at the edge of the driveway. Marcus Tate stood in the doorway, his muscular frame casting a long shadow across the porch. His sharp brown eyes flicked between the two uniformed figures before him, instantly detecting something was off. "Step outside, sir," one of them ordered. His voice was clipped, authoritative, trying too hard to sound official. "You're trespassing on private property." Marcus's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "This is my home," he said evenly, his deep voice carrying a weight of both confidence and warning. The second man, slightly shorter but broader in build, took a step forward, resting a hand on his holster. "We got a report of an illegal occupant in this residence. We need you to come with us." Marcus didn't move. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a lie when he heard one. The details didn't add up. Their uniforms were close to regulation, but not quite right. The stitching on the patches was slightly off, the belts held generic holsters, and most glaringly, they weren't wearing badges. These men weren't police officers. They were impersonators, and someone had sent them. His mind immediately jumped to the obvious culprit. Richard Davenport, the HOA president, had been a problem from day one. Marcus had lived through discrimination before. He grew up in a neighborhood where he had to fight for every inch of respect, where officers patrolled like enforcers rather than protectors. That history fueled his career. He had worked his way up from patrol officer to detective, and eventually to chief of police. He had spent his career ensuring justice was served, but now justice was knocking on his own door, twisted into a weapon against him. The moment he and his family moved into the gated community, it was clear they weren't welcome. Richard Davenport was the type of man who thrived on control. A retired CEO with too much time on his hands, he ran the homeowners association like a kingdom. He had made it known, subtly at first, then more overtly, that the Tate family did not belong. The complaints started immediately. Loud music late at night? They weren't even home that evening. Suspicious activity near the walking trail? Marcus had been jogging, disturbing the peace. His son, Jordan, had been playing basketball in their driveway. It was clear what was happening. Davenport wanted them gone. And tonight, he had escalated to a new level. Marcus's hand gripped the doorframe, his pulse steady but strong. He could handle himself. But inside, just out of sight, Angela and Jordan were watching. Angela, his wife, had already warned him. "They're pushing you, Marcus. They're waiting for you to snap. Don't give them what they want." She was right. He had to play this carefully. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. "Which precinct are you from?" The two men hesitated. It was brief, just a flicker of uncertainty, but Marcus caught it. The shorter one recovered first. "That's not your concern. What's your name?" Marcus nearly laughed at the irony. They didn't even know his name. This wasn't an actual police operation. This was an intimidation tactic. And it was sloppy. He crossed his arms, leveling them with a piercing gaze. "If you were real officers, you'd know exactly who I am." He let that sink in before adding, "Now, I'll ask you again. What precinct are you with?" The taller man's fingers twitched at his belt. He was nervous now. "Good. We don't have to answer your questions." The shorter one shot back. "Either come with us, or we'll have to take you in by force." Marcus's heart pounded, not in fear, but in calculation. He had faced real threats before. This was amateur hour. Still, these men were desperate, and desperation could turn dangerous. If he made the wrong move, things could spiral fast. And just as Marcus was deciding his next step, a familiar voice rang out from the sidewalk. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus turned his head slightly. Standing at the curb, arms crossed and wearing a smug expression, was Richard Davenport himself. Marcus exhaled slowly. So the puppet master decided to show his face. The game had just changed. Marcus locked eyes with Richard Davenport, the smugness radiating off the HOA president like heat from pavement. Dressed in an expensive golf polo and khakis, Davenport looked every bit the entitled ruler of the neighborhood. He had his arms crossed over his chest, standing just close enough to observe but far enough to feign innocence. Marcus exhaled through his nose, steadying his anger. He already knew how this would play out. Davenport would act as if he had nothing to do with this, playing the concerned community leader. But Marcus also knew better. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. Davenport took a slow step forward. "I heard there was some trouble here," he said, his voice laced with false politeness. "Officers, is everything under control?" The two fake cops glanced at each other. Davenport was too good. He had chosen his words carefully. "Not your officers, not the officers, just officers," as if these men were legitimate. Marcus took a step forward, his presence commanding. "You sent them, didn't you?" His voice was calm, but his words cut like steel. Davenport's expression flickered, just for a moment. Then he let out a forced chuckle. "Now, Chief Tate." Marcus's eyes darkened. "That's Chief of Police Tate." The taller of the two impostors stiffened, his face draining of color. Davenport, however, barely reacted. He gave Marcus a slow, exaggerated once-over, like he was assessing an inconvenience. "Chief or not," he said, "I don't know what you're implying." Marcus let a slow smirk creep across his face. "You sent them here to intimidate me, but you really should have done your homework." Davenport's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "All I know is that our HOA received multiple reports about an unidentified individual living in this house." He turned his head slightly, looking at the fake cops. "Naturally, we were concerned. I believe our local officers were simply investigating." Marcus's smirk vanished. This man was dangerous, not because he had power, but because he knew how to twist reality. "My name is on the deed," Marcus said coldly. "I signed every closing document." "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Davenport sighed, acting as if this conversation was beneath him. "Look, Chief Tate, I don't think you understand the severity of what you've done," Marcus interrupted. "Impersonating an officer? That's a felony." He turned his gaze to the two men still standing awkwardly by the patrol car. "Which means both of you are looking at prison time." Now they looked scared. Davenport, however, was unfazed. "Now, let's not be dramatic. These men are simply community volunteers, ensuring the safety of our neighborhood." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Community volunteers?" He let out a short laugh. "Is that what you're calling them?" Davenport took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough so that only Marcus could hear. "You don't belong here." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists. "I'm giving you an opportunity, Marcus," Davenport continued smoothly. "There's still time to leave quietly. No need for things to get unpleasant." Marcus held his gaze unblinking. "I don't scare easily." Davenport tilted his head slightly. "That's a shame, because I don't lose easily." The tension was suffocating. The fake cops stood frozen, unsure of their next move. Davenport remained confident, believing he still had control of the situation. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He took a step forward, towering over the smug HOA president. "You just made a big mistake," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low, and before Davenport could respond, the distant wail of real police sirens filled the night air. Marcus saw it before Davenport did, the flicker of panic in his eyes. Davenport turned, eyes darting down the street, where the unmistakable glow of multiple squad cars approached. Angela had called the real police. Marcus smiled. "Let's see how well you handle losing." The air was thick with tension as the real police sirens grew louder. The two fake officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, realizing that their charade was unraveling fast. But Marcus knew men like them. Cornered, desperate, and unpredictable. That made them dangerous. Still, he played along. "Badge numbers," Marcus repeated, his voice steady but firm. "Which precinct are you with?" The shorter of the two fakes squared his shoulders. "You don't need that information," Step off the property now. Marcus cocked his head. You're about to have a real problem. The taller man's patience snapped. He gritted his teeth, gripping his holster. Step out now or we'll make you. Angela gasped from the doorway. Marcus! A single movement could set off a disaster. Marcus had seen it before. A nervous, power-hungry man with a weapon and something to prove was a recipe for bloodshed. All right, Marcus said, lifting his hands slightly, acting as if he was surrendering. No need to get trigger-happy. Davenport smirked from the curb. He thought he was winning, but Marcus wasn't done yet. From behind him, Marcus heard the shuffling of footsteps. Jordan, his 16-year-old son, had stepped outside, phone in hand, recording everything. This is going on live, Jordan announced, holding his phone high. I hope y'all got lawyers. Marcus felt a swell of pride and fear at the same time. His son was brave, but Jordan had no idea just how ugly things could get. The shorter fake officer's eyes widened. Put that phone down, he barked, stepping toward Jordan. Jordan didn't budge. I have every right to record. First Amendment. The fake cop lunged. Jordan, move, Marcus shouted. Too late. The imposter snatched the phone, raising it high before slamming it onto the pavement. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of glass. Angela screamed. Jordan stumbled back, staring at the broken phone in disbelief. Hey, that's illegal. You can't. The fake cop grabbed Jordan's arm next. Marcus saw red. Before Marcus could react, the taller fake officer took advantage of his distraction, lunging forward and grabbing Marcus's wrist, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Marcus's arm, but he didn't fight. Not yet. He needed to be smart. The shorter cop released Jordan, shoving him back toward the house. Angela caught him, pulling him close, her face etched in terror. Marcus, she cried. The fake officers shoved Marcus forward, trying to force him toward the patrol car they brought. A car that Marcus now knew was stolen or rented. Davenport watched, arms crossed, looking entirely too satisfied. Marcus took a calming breath. He had no gun, no badge, and no backup yet. But he had one thing left. His mind. Marcus let his body go limp, acting as if he was giving up. The fake officers let their grips loosen ever so slightly. That was all he needed. Using their own momentum, Marcus yanked forward, throwing the taller one off balance. The man stumbled and Marcus twisted free. Davenport's smirk disappeared. The shorter fake officer tried to reach for his weapon, but Marcus closed the distance in a blink, snatching the gun from the holster before the man could even react. Angela gasped. Jordan's eyes went wide. Marcus took a step back, keeping the stolen weapon low but ready. Now, Marcus said, his voice like steel. We're gonna have a real conversation. The fake cops froze. They knew they'd lost control. Davenport, however, stepped forward, his smirk returning. Oh, Chief, he said smoothly, you just made a very big mistake. And then, from the distance, the sound of real police cruisers screeched into the neighborhood. The screech of real police cruisers cutting through the night was the sweetest sound Marcus had heard in a long time. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the street, making the fake officers squint in panic. Marcus didn't lower the stolen weapon, but he kept his grip loose. He didn't need to escalate, he had already won. Davenport's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, stuffing his hands in his pockets and stepping back. His confidence, however, was cracking. The fake officers weren't as composed. They exchanged frantic glances, knowing their ruse was up. The first real police car jerked to a stop, and within seconds, uniformed officers piled out, weapons drawn. Drop the weapon. Hands in the air, one of them shouted. Marcus didn't hesitate. The last thing he needed was one of his own officers mistaking him for a threat. He immediately bent down, placed the stolen gun on the pavement, and raised his hands. It's me, Chief Tate, he called, his voice steady. The moment his name registered, the tension shifted instantly. The officer in charge, Sergeant Reynolds, immediately lowered his gun. Chief, Reynolds blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. What the hell is going on here? Marcus exhaled. I was about to ask the same thing. The two imposters didn't wait for an explanation. The shorter one took a sudden step back, his eyes darting toward Davenport. Richard? Davenport immediately shook his head, stepping away as if distancing himself. I don't know these men. Coward. The taller fake cop suddenly bolted toward the patrol car. Big mistake. Don't move, Reynolds barked. Too late. Two officers tackled the imposter to the ground, forcing his hands behind his back. He screamed as his face slammed into the pavement. The second fake cop froze, realizing there was nowhere to run. Down on your knees, another officer ordered. The second fake officer complied, trembling as cuffs snapped around his wrists. Marcus dusted off his sleeves, watching the two frauds fall apart. They were so tough minutes ago. Marcus turned his attention to the real mastermind, Richard Davenport. The HOA president was already walking away toward his house, hands in his pockets, as if none of this concerned him. Davenport, Marcus called. His voice was calm. Dangerous. Davenport stopped but didn't turn around. I have nothing to do with this, Chief Tate. Marcus nodded slowly, stepping forward. That's funny, because the moment those two got caught, they looked straight at you. Davenport sighed dramatically, turning with a smug expression. You have no proof. I was simply a concerned neighbor. Marcus let the silence stretch. Then he turned to Jordan, who was smiling. Oh, don't worry, Jordan said, crossing his arms. We got proof. Davenport frowned. What? Angela stepped forward, pulling out her phone. She held up the screen, a recording of the entire encounter. Marcus smirked. See, Richard, he said, tilting his head. Your boys here thought smashing one phone would erase everything. But my wife, he gestured toward Angela. She records everything. Davenport's face turned red. His jaw clenched. You set this whole thing up, Marcus continued. Sent fake cops. Violated multiple federal laws. And now there's a recording. Reynolds turned to Marcus. You want me to take him in? Davenport blanched. You can't do that. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Why not? You're a criminal, Richard. For the first time that night, Richard Davenport was speechless. Marcus turned to Reynolds. Book him. The officers moved in. Davenport started shouting. This is harassment. You can't do this. I'm on the HOA board. Marcus smiled. Yeah? Well, I'm the chief of police. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Angela and Jordan. His wife exhaled in relief, pulling Jordan into a hug. Jordan grinned. Dad, that was epic. Marcus chuckled. Yeah, son, it was. But deep down, he knew this was just one battle. People like Davenport never stopped scheming. And Marcus? He would always be ready. The night air was thick with tension, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the polished houses of the neighborhood. The two fake officers, once so sure of themselves, now stood frozen, their hands hovering near their useless weapons. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward. The calm restraint he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by the sheer force of his true authority. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. The shorter imposter swallowed hard. The taller one, the more aggressive of the two, glanced toward Davenport as if searching for an escape plan. But there was nowhere left to run. Sirens roared as two more squad cars pulled up, their tires screeching against the pavement. The doors flung open, and uniformed officers poured out, weapons raised. Drop your weapons. Hands on your head. Marcus didn't even flinch. But the fake cops? Their faces drained of color. Then it happened. Sergeant Reynolds stepped out of the squad car, his gaze scanning the scene. The moment his eyes locked onto Marcus, he snapped into action. Chief Tate. Like clockwork, every officer present saluted. The silence that followed was deafening. The fake officers, still with their hands raised, were now shaking visibly. Their entire plan had depended on Marcus being just another powerless black man, someone they could intimidate, arrest, and remove quietly. They never expected him to be the most powerful law enforcement officer in the county. Richard Davenport, standing off to the side, looked like a man watching his own execution in real time. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just took one more step forward. "These two men," he said, his voice booming across the street, "are not officers. They are criminals impersonating law enforcement. And this man," he pointed straight at Davenport, "orchestrated the entire thing." Davenport visibly flinched. I had nothing to do with this," he stammered, stepping back. "This is a misunderstanding." Marcus tilted his head. "Oh, is that right?" He turned to Sergeant Reynolds. "Check their pockets." The shorter fake cop immediately protested. "You can't." But the officers were already moving. Reynolds grabbed the shorter one, roughly pulling a folded check out of his pocket. He held it up to the light, then turned to Marcus. "Sir," he said with quiet satisfaction, "this check is signed by Richard Davenport." Marcus nodded. "Game over." Richard Davenport's face went ashen. His eyes darted between the officers, the check with his signature, and the two fake cops now visibly trembling. Marcus folded his arms across his chest, his voice calm but unshakable. "You were saying, Richard?" Davenport backpedaled. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe. You don't understand, Chief Tate. These men were just hired security, private contractors." Marcus took a slow step forward. "You paid them to impersonate police officers, trespass on my property, and attempt a false arrest." He turned to the surrounding officers. "That's impersonating an officer, unlawful detainment, breaking and entering. Shall I keep going?" Reynolds smirked. "Sounds like at least a dozen charges, sir." Davenport's eyes widened. "Now wait just a damn minute." Suddenly, the taller imposter made a desperate move. He shoved the officer closest to him and bolted down the street, his boots slapping against the pavement. The shorter one, panicking, followed. Marcus didn't flinch. They didn't get far. Two officers tackled the taller one to the ground, his face slamming into the pavement with a grunt of pain. The shorter fake cop tripped over the curb, landing hard on his stomach. Before he could push himself up, Jordan stepped forward and planted a foot on his back. "You good, Dad?" Jordan called out. Marcus grinned. "I'm good, son." The officers finished cuffing the men and hauling them to their feet. The once arrogant imposters were now shaking, humiliated, and silent. Davenport's composure shattered completely. "You can't do this to me," he raged. "I'm an HOA board member. I have rights." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you do. And you'll be able to exercise them in court." Reynolds stepped up behind Davenport, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Davenport whipped around in shock. You can't arrest me." Reynolds smirked. "I think we just did." The officers led Davenport toward the waiting squad car. As they did, neighbors started stepping outside, their porch lights flicking on one by one. Some were recording the scene. Others whispered amongst themselves. Angela, still standing by the front door, lifted her phone and held it up just high enough for Davenport to see. "Smile for the camera," she said smoothly. "I'm sure this will go viral by morning." Davenport's face twisted in rage as the car door slammed shut behind him. Marcus let out a slow breath, finally allowing himself to relax. Jordan nudged him. "Dad, you know this is going to be all over the internet, right?" Marcus smirked. "Good. Let people see what happens when you try to play police in my city." The night had started with a threat, but it ended with justice. And Marcus Tate had made sure everyone felt it. The night had been long, but justice had been swift. As the last police cruiser pulled away, taking Richard Davenport and his hired imposters with it, Marcus stood in the middle of his driveway, arms crossed, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. The once quiet neighborhood was now wide awake. Porch lights flickered on. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains or stepped onto their lawns, whispering among themselves. Some were still recording, capturing the moment that would soon go viral. Marcus didn't care about the cameras. He cared about the message this night would send. Angela came up beside him, sliding a hand into his. "You okay?" He exhaled. Yeah. Jordan grinned, still riding the adrenaline rush. That was legendary. Marcus shook his head with a chuckle. Not exactly how I wanted to spend my evening, son. Jordan pointed at the empty street where the squad cars had just been. Maybe not, but you just took down a racist HOA president and some fake cops. That's gotta be a record. Marcus smirked. It's definitely something. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about one night. It was about everything leading up to it. The fallout begins. The next morning, the headlines exploded. HOA president caught hiring fake cops in racist attempt to remove black family. Chief of police exposes corrupt HOA in shocking viral footage. News stations ran clips of the night before, highlighting Marcus's calm demeanor versus Davenport's unraveling arrogance. The internet tore into Davenport, unearthing past complaints of discrimination within the HOA. By noon, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. By 3 p.m., Davenport resigned in disgrace. By 6 p.m., Marcus received a call from his attorney. Several civil rights organizations were already preparing lawsuits against the HOA for discriminatory practices. Marcus had won. But the battle wasn't over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood on his front porch, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood. His neighborhood. It didn't belong to Richard Davenport. It didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to every family that lived there, including his own. The events of the past 24 hours had set off a chain reaction. The HOA was now under investigation for discriminatory practices. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were suddenly voicing their outrage. And the footage of Davenport's arrest had spread across the internet like wildfire. Angela stepped outside, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to Marcus, then leaned against the railing. "You did it," she said softly. Marcus took a sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "For now." Angela gave him a knowing look. "You don't think this is over?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "People like Davenport don't just disappear. He'll try to weasel his way out of this. Try to make himself the victim." Angela sighed, rolling her eyes. "I hate that you're right." The door creaked open behind them. Jordan stepped out, hands in his pockets, his face thoughtful. "Hey, Dad." Marcus turned to him. "Yeah." Jordan hesitated before asking, "Do you ever get tired of fighting these battles?" Marcus studied his son's face, the curiosity, the frustration, the understanding. He recognized it because he had asked himself the same question 100 times before. He let out a slow breath and answered, "As long as they keep coming, I'll keep winning." Jordan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good." They stood there together, watching the stars peek out over the quiet streets. For the first time since moving here, the neighborhood truly felt like home. Marcus took another sip of coffee, his voice steady as he spoke his final words of the night. "Power is knowing who you are, even when others try to strip it away." And that was something no one, not Richard Davenport, not a corrupt HOA, not fake cops, could ever take from him.